Hey everyone, welcome. It's Baron, and in this video we're going to discuss Grinding Gear Games' recent release of the content reveal and patch notes for the upcoming Path of Exile 2 patch 0.3, which they are referring to as the Third Edict, and which we now know also includes Path of Exile 2's first official league, Rise of the Abyssal. For those of you who follow my PoE 1 content, I am nearly done editing my big redo of the comprehensive beginner currency guide, but big news like this has to take priority, so I'm taking a quick break from editing that to here go over the highlights on the upcoming PoE 2 League. So here are the super high level hits I'm going to be discussing, many of which are shown on Grinding Gear Games' nice infographic here. No Druid or any other new class or Ascendancy. No new Ascendancy trial either, though I suspect they probably wanted to coincide Trial of the Ancestors with the Karui-themed Act 4, so I kind of wonder what went wrong there. Yes to Act 4, we're getting that, and then with some additional side content to bridge the gap from campaign, it means that we no longer have to repeat the campaign before getting to endgame maps. At long last, the inclusion of asynchronous trading, aka offline trading, of all items, not just currency, but equipment too. The inclusion of unlimited sprinting, a big support gem overhaul, big what I would call middle end game crafting overhaul with a lot of new crafting currencies, dozens of new nodes on the skill tree, I think over 100, and then of course PoE 2's first official league, Abyss. For those of you who are familiar from PoE 1, it is a massively revamped version of the PoE 1 mechanic. And then a slew of class and item balance changes and other modifications that'll impact build design. Not going to have time to go through all of them in this video. I'll try to call out a few highlights. Now, as usual, I first tried to do this video as more of a free-flowing, unscripted scroll through the patch notes, and as usual, I had to stop recording when I was at like 45 minutes, not even halfway through the patch notes, and rambling about some specific skill change. I caught myself, and I was like, all right, let's put a little structure on this. So I scrapped that recording, and let's go through a slightly more streamlined, focused review of the patch notes. I'll try to call out specific highlight-type stuff, points of interest for me. So fully acknowledge that there are many things, maybe even many important things that I won't have time to address in this video, but there are plenty of other patch note reviews out there from other creators who may touch on different points. And then of course, the patch notes themselves are available for your perusal. I will link them down in the description. So let's start scrolling. We've got Act 4, like I said, Karui themed, and we've also got some information about the Rise of the Abyssal's League. Not going to go through the whole thing, basically just abysses are these green cracks in the ground from which monsters spew out of. It works a little bit differently than it did in PoE 1, but the general look and feel of it seems pretty similar. And they are also introducing new rewards, crafting type items that they kind of seem like a fusion of like syndicate crafting with a little bit of Scourge and a little bit of, I don't know, Necropolis, something like that. A few different things, probably closest resembling to Syndicate because you are adding a sort of veiled modifier to an item, and then you get to unveil it or whatever they're calling it here, and you choose one of 3 options to add to your item. So that's pretty cool. Scrolling. So let's get in and talk about the support gems. They have removed the restriction on 1 support gem of each type per build. So now you can use in each of your setups, you could use Chance to Poison. In each of your setups, you could use Concentrated Effect or what have you. And they have also added a bunch of new support gems and added different tiers for the support gems, as well as a special unique type of support gem they are calling lineage gems. In particular, I love the addition of the tiers of support gems. This always felt lacking in Path of Exile 2. Both PoE 1 and 2 have a system of unlocking additional types of support gems as you proceed through the campaign, but in PoE 2, by assigning this kind of arbitrary tier number, it made it seem like there was a kind of numerical progression there, like your tier 1, 2, and 3 support gems, whereas in fact there wasn't. It was just you were unlocking different types of them as you went. But now there is a true numerical progression system where getting to higher levels can actually improve your damage through another vector, and I love that. I do have some mild concerns that these will be area level locked, that you won't even be able to find rarely higher level support gems at lower levels. And if so, this would continue to exacerbate the problem in PoE 2 where you can't like over level your problems, which always felt a little ugly, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Among the new gems that are being added, scrolling here, I'm just going to call out a few because they're adding several. One of the ones I'll call out is Forge Hammer. I know my buddy Jorgen is going to be using that one. This is a hilarious looking, like, what if Thor was a fire god kind of a skill. You throw your hammer, it embeds in the ground, and then it gets a fun interaction with war cries where there'll be an explosion, like with Earth Shatter, how the spikes explode when you war cry. I will also call out Mortar Cannon here. This is a totem that will accept a grenade skill, so it's like a meta skill gem in that way, and it'll just fire off whatever grenade skill you put in it. And so I like a lot of the utility and combos this enables, even if you don't do this as your main damage dealing skill setup. And I think there's going to be room for that. But even if you just have this as kind of like an adjunct to deal a little bit more damage or to set up some combos, in particular, Tactician will make good use of this. They got a lot of love this patch. Now, a lot of people seem excited about this Ravenous Swarm gem. This is one that causes insects to periodically pop out of you and attack and poison enemies. I'm going to reserve judgment on this one until I see some numbers. This, in my opinion, lives or dies based on whether Grinding Gear games want this to be more than like a strange utility type skill or whether they actually intend it to be a sizable component of your damage. We just don't know yet. And then the last one to call out is going to be a negative one. So where did we go? Looking for Siphon Elements here. Yeah. So not by itself do I think this is a bad thing. It's more like it's a canary in the coal mine. This is like indicative of a wide swath of changes that they're making. Specifically, this idea they're pushing of what they're calling elemental infusions, these areas that get created on the ground when you do certain things, and then you can walk over them to get a stack of infusion, which you can use for different boosts and buffs and stuff. And like, my complaint is not really complicated. I just dislike that playstyle of having to like trudge over and walk over the thing that you're creating. I don't like it in Acolyte of Chayula. I don't like it much here either. I'm not going to be using it, and I guess I just hope that not too much development time or design space is being sacrificed to include something like that, which, like, I don't know how many people are actually going to make use of it. Even if it was very numerically powerful, there's a lot to be said for a build that just feels good to play, and I'm not sure that will. But let's move on and talk about new keystones. So one of the signature ones that everybody's excited about is Hollow Palm Technique. This is a keystone that enables unarmed combat, and it's relatively similar to its Path of Exile 1 incarnation, but it does lack the literal punch of scaling flat damage in any way. In PoE 1, you scale flat physical damage with dexterity, which is why Hollow Palm builds are dex stacking builds in PoE 1, and that's kind of its defining feature in that game. Instead, here, you're not wielding a weapon, so the keystone has to scale the damage somehow. What it does is it adds flat damage to the gem based on the gem's level, like a spell would do. And so that means that Grinding Gear games must have had to come up with some flat attack damage numbers to add on to these gems that they don't currently have to make them more similar to spells whenever you use Hollow Palm Technique with them. And then also it scales more attack speed, a multiplier, not just increase, but more attack speed per evasion rating on your items, and base critical chance per energy shield on your items. So those are two potent scaling vectors. So I'm curious to see how this works out. I will say it can only be used with quarterstaff skills, which is kind of a little unfortunate to me. It limits its utility. Like, I like the idea of using strike skills and slam skills and stuff from other weapon types with this, but oh well, what are you going to do? There's still a lot of options here, especially for right side of the tree builds, because, like, look, you're already going to be stacking ES Innovation anyways over there. Like, Invoker is a clear, obvious, like, that's the most obvious choice. They want you to run this with an Invoker because they already care about scaling evasion and energy shield to get more spirit out of it. But, like, there's, I think, a lot of Ascendancies, other than the obvious one, would have some fun things to play around with here that they, that could benefit from a generic bonus to attack speed and base crit. So we'll see. The other one that I kind of like is Black Flame Covenant. Let's just make sure that's on screen. Yeah, here we go. Black Flame Covenant, this is one that has an effect that is similar to the Black Flame Amethyst Ring from PoE 1. So this keystone converts all your fire hit damage to chaos, causes that chaos damage to contribute to ignite, and it causes even those ignites, the damage over time, to also deal chaos damage. It's not usually possible to convert damage over time, so this is a special case where you're doing something like conversion. It's dealing chaos damage instead. It's interesting because not every Ignite build wants this by default, like you want a good reason to take it, but it does open up some interesting design space. In particular, I might be looking at like a Lich might play well with this. I don't know. We'll have to play around with it in PoB. At this point, they address some of the crafting changes. At this point in the patch notes, they add a bunch of crafting currencies, and these crafting currencies all have the effect of adding mods that have guaranteed minimum level of the modifier, so you get a little bit more agency in your crafting process. So I like this change. I think we're going to see a lot of this for, like I said, kind of mid-level endgame crafting. It's not going to make those super duper ultra elite best in slot items unless you get very lucky, but this is a way of introducing some agency over that, like, I'm in red maps, I've got a fair bit of currency, but not like a ton, and I want to craft myself an upgrade. I think that's where we're going to see this. But meanwhile, those ultra endgame items, that's probably going to use the other new currency they're adding, the Hinakora's Lock, making its way over from PoE 1. This adds the rare, you're not going to get this often, but adds the hideously powerful ability to foresee the result of whatever the next currency item you would use on it is, and then either elect to take that outcome or don't, and the Hinakora's Lock is consumed, you lose it, but you have now a new opportunity for a different thing to happen when you apply that crafting currency. So the way these are used are in large stacks, like really big stacks, and they are very expensive even individually. You use one, you see an outcome you don't like, you delete the lock and you apply another lock and you see a different outcome and you decide whether you like that or not, and you do this over and over again until you get the perfect outcome. So this is only for those like crazy expensive crafts, but it's interesting that it's in there. Let's see. Change to bosses. So the big boss change is just that the lower tiers of boss have had the cost of entry lowered. So it removes this kind of weird reverse synergy where you were incentivized to sell your boss entry tokens to someone else unless you could reliably nuke the highest difficulty tier of boss, because the price of buying and selling those fragments was all based around the people who could use them the most effectively by tackling the highest tier, best reward version of the boss. It's just a little disheartening that, like, they've solved this problem before. Like, they've solved this in PoE 1. It's such an easy, straightforward win. I'm glad they did it. It just seems like they go backwards on so many things and have to rediscover the solutions, because they did this solution with Uber bosses in PoE 1 a little while, over a year ago now. So anyways, we'll keep scrolling. We'll talk about the change to map mods. Let's see, we've got that here. So this is an intuitive one. Now, instead of some upside mods and some downside mods, every mod comes with some of each. And to me, this is just more sensible. It more directly correlates difficulty and reward. You get a difficult modifier, but that difficult modifier also adds a commensurate amount of reward. I think it makes more sense this way. So good. Essences, where do we go? There we go. Essences. This is also going to play into that crafting change with those added currencies we just discussed. So now essences become a sort of fusion of their prior PoE 2 form and their current PoE 1 form. They aren't either of those things, but they're kind of somewhere in between. So what they do now is they add a mod to an item rather than entirely re-rolling the item, and that mod is deterministic. You always know which mod you're going to get. You're not adding one that, fits a certain archetype, like add a mana modifier. No, you will know exactly which mod you're going to get, but you can only apply these to magic items to make them rare. They work like regal orbs. So I actually really like this system. I might even like this more than the PoE 1 version. This makes crafting a much more stepwise process. You get the magic item that you want, that you need, it's got the modifiers you want, and then you move on to the next step of adding this, and so now you've got a 3 mod item that is exactly what you want, and you can add one of those new crafting currencies to have a pretty good shot at getting a fourth, maybe even a fifth or a sixth mod like that. My only remaining complaint is that getting that initial magic item with one or two good mods on it is still a tedious process of picking up a zillion bases, which I just don't want to do. You know, the trading changes that we'll cover, maybe that make that a little bit easier, but I really think they need to reintroduce the Orb of Alteration and the Scouring Orb, which make that initial item crafting process, the first couple steps, much less painful. You know, I hear their logic on why they don't want to do that, and I just think the benefits of reintroducing those currencies outweigh the costs. So let's keep going, and let's get to the big one, which is Sprint. If you hold down the dodge roll button, your character will now go into a high movement speed sprint after they finish the roll. It is unlimited, there is no potion, there is no endurance bar, there is no stamina bar, you just run. This is, of course, Grinding Gear Games' latest attempt to solve the movement speed sluggishness issue without going back to Quicksilver Flasks from PoE 1. If they implement this right, and I hope they do, if they've implemented this right, it might actually be even better than Quicksilver Flask. So let's cross our fingers on that one. It does come with the drawback that if you get hit by an enemy while sprinting, you get knocked down. It's like a super stun. You're probably going to die unless you're very tanky. But I think that seems like a reasonable restriction. And as they said in the presentation, and I was thinking it myself right as they said it, it seems easy enough to just see an enemy and immediately use a skill. Using a skill cancels you out of the sprint, and then you have no problem. So I've got zero issues with that drawback of getting knocked down. I hope this works out. I do think that to this point about the feeling of sluggishness in maps, they could still use a fair chunk of work on the map layouts, some of which are just like aggressively adversarial design decisions. It feels like the developers are deliberately making it feel bad for the player. So hopefully they've done some work on that, but I do really like this step of including sprinting. I like the change that they talk about here about attribute requirements. So attribute requirements, they're just lowering across the board all attribute requirements on gear and gems with the stated goal, they've said, of just letting you focus a little less on that stuff on your passive tree and assign your passive points to more interesting notables. To go along with this change, they've also, in that outermost ring on the passive tree, there's a certain number of attribute nodes between each of the class's starting positions, and they've just subtracted one from each section of the tree. So just going around the outside edge takes fewer points, and you have to spend fewer points on boring attributes, and you don't need them as much with this change. So that's a great change, no notes. On the other hand, this change to Ignite in this new debuff flammability, I don't know about this one. So the flammability debuff, it kind of mimics like what Hoarfrost does on the Warden Ascendancy in PoE 1, where you build up and up and up the ability to do an Ignite. I don't know, this seems unnecessarily complicated to me. I go back and forth. Like, having complexity in the game is good, but, you know, I just want to see what kind of build decisions this encourages. Like, does this make a difference, or is this just complexity for complexity's sake? I don't yet see the point of this one, but we'll see how it shakes out. Might be interesting. I do like the change to guard. Let's skip down to that. Yeah, gaining guard. So it doesn't just automatically, if you get a new stack of guard, automatically replace the old one. It might if the new stack of guard would have a higher amount of guard, but it checks first. If it would have added a smaller amount of guard and replaced your current buff with a worse one, basically, it no longer does that. In that circumstance where it finds it would have been adding a lower amount of guard, it just adds on to the duration of your current guard. Because remember, guard is the amount that gets shaved off of damage before you get hit. And it has both an amount and a duration. So either the amount gets expired because you take a big hit, or the duration expires. Either way, it causes you to lose the guard. So what it does is, however much guard the new one would have given you, that's used as a kind of proportion, and you get a certain amount of added duration to your current guard based on that. This isn't quite as good as if the new guard instance would add both duration and amount to the existing guard, but I can understand why they wouldn't want to go that route, and I think this is a reasonable enough compromise. Now, let's scroll down a little further and let's talk about this block business, because I'm going to take a little extra time on this because it's a big deal, at least to me. I'm a guy who loves block characters, so for me personally, this is an impactful change. Basically, all characters now start with a maximum block of 50%, not 75%. But block now works the way it does in PoE 1, where you can block anything that isn't explicitly unblockable. You know that in PoE 2 it's that red flashing circle? So those are still unblockable, but everything else is now blockable. Spells, attacks, AoEs, projectiles, all of it. So this is the effect, if you remember, that the Warbringer used to give by taking the Turtle Charm Ascendancy. Well, now everybody gets this effect, but with a lower, much lower cap on block. Instead, the Warbringer kind of flip-flops the two so that they kind of maintain the same general effect, but through the opposite means. So now, since everybody has that ability to block everything, Turtle Charm just brings their maximum block back up to 75% where it was. But this does constitute a nerf for the Warbringer because it comes with the modest downside of taking 30% of damage from all blocked hits. Now look, that's not as severe a downside as the nasty glancing blows in PoE 1 where you take 65% of damage from hits. 30% is overcomable, regen, leech, and especially life on block, but this is a real downside, you know, so you do have to consider this a nerf because the downside is real. It's something that you have to invest into overcoming. This also means that you've got Svalin, and now if you roll that with a maximum roll where it's only subtracting 10% from your maximum chance to block before applying that lucky block, this works out so that a normal character, a non-Warbringer, will have an effective maximum block chance of 64% with a perfect roll on Svalin. And then it is the usual 87% chance for Warbringer and a perfect Svalin roll, but of course it does come with the drawback now of taking some damage. I think, here's my take on this, just my quick analysis before we get a chance to play it. I think on the whole, this relegates block from its status as like a secondary defensive mechanic down to like a tertiary defensive layer, where like you really need to make sure you've got other defensive layers. You can't consider this one of your primaries anymore. And one of, get your health pool, get your recovery, and one of the things that people are probably going to get either in place of or in addition to block is this new mechanic called deflect. Now, unfortunately, they actually didn't include in the patch notes a specific section defining what deflect is, so I'll just tell you. If you're a PoE 1 player, you can consider this very similar to suppression, but it applies to both spells and attacks. You stack up your chance to deflect up to hopefully a maximum of 100% to deflect everything, and then deflecting shaves off 40% of damage from all incoming hits. In PoE 1, suppression is 50%. Here it's only 40, but it does apply to both attacks and spells, so that's kind of a fair trade-off. There is one unusual difference from suppression, though. This is not a traditional 0 to 100% scale. Like in PoE 1, suppression, I get 12% from this node, 8% from this node, 22% of my body armor, and as long as that number hits 100, you suppress everything by default. Here it doesn't work like that. It's actually more of a rating system that I think will go into the hundreds or thousands like evasion does, and that number, whatever it is a bit more arbitrary. It doesn't automatically mean 100%. It instead gets assessed against the monster's accuracy number. So blinding enemies can increase your effective deflection chance. I just hope it's not too hard to calculate, okay, all right, if I don't want to think about this, if I don't want to blind the enemy, how much deflect do I need to deflect literally all damage, even from the most accurate monsters in the game? Because one of the strengths of suppression was that it was fairly easy to understand. Just reach that 100% number and you're done. You always get the benefit. But regardless of how easy or hard it is to understand, I do suspect that deflect will wind up being a mandatory defensive layer for a lot of builds, including, I think, a lot of those that you wouldn't necessarily expect. With deflect being focused on the right side, the evasion side of the tree, I expect to see classes like the Warbringer and others invest into this because it's going to be pretty potent. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to skip over a little bit right here. Just a few modest-sized, interesting changes that I'd love to discuss, but I'm trying to keep the video to a manageable length. I encourage reading the full patch notes if you're interested. But let's go on to the Ascendancy changes. So you've got the aforementioned Warbringer block changes, plus some buffs to that Ascendancy, so this is going to be very interesting. I'd like to try this out. Smith of Katava takes some probably deserved nerfs. They're only moderate nerfs, and he was overperforming on the defensive front. Tactician gets some buffs, which is exciting because I like that class. It's not going to be my league starter because I played a lot of it at the end of last league, but it's worth taking a look at. Blood Mage, where'd we go with Blood Mage? No longer has to waste a point on Sanguimancy to get the mana cost changed to life. That's just a natural feature of the Ascendancy now. If you assign any Ascendancy points, you get this effect as well. Now, that means that you basically get an extra point back. Like, so you're getting, a certain percentage more points than you had before. So that seems pretty good. But other than that, the other Ascendancy changes, the other classes, most of the rest of them either aren't too interesting for me or are outright disappointing. Like, I'm disappointed to see that there is a sizable chunk of notes about the Acolyte of Chayula here, which I feel is a thematically cool class that has a lot of potential. But this litany of changes, it just amounts numerically to be a neutral change at best. These changes add a lot of complexity and weirdness, but do they make it good? I don't think they do. We'll have to see, but I'm frankly not super impressed with these changes here. Just a little minor note on the Chronomancer down near the bottom here. The Quicksand Hourglass notable changes, listen, it changes what the notable does, but it doesn't solve its central problem. And the central problem is that it is a cycling buff, and cycling buffs feel terrible. You have no agency over it. Sometimes you're weaker, sometimes you're stronger, and you just kind of have to wait for it, like waiting for a stoplight. Nobody likes that. It does. This does nothing for me. But the other change is interesting there. The Inevitable Agony curse that it adds, it seems on first reading that this enables something like you could ignite a boss with one big massive hit, even if your skills only do normally small hits. This kind of transforms all those small little hits into one big punch, assuming the numbers are there. We'll have to see. But now we scroll down, and here is the part of the notes where they've added around 100 new nodes to the tree, keystones, and a lot of notables. Now, for the notables, of which there are a ton, it looks like, we have to kind of temper our expectations about this, or we need to just keep our excitement in check because it should rest entirely on what these notables do. We don't know what a lot of these do yet, and remember, a lot of the current nodes on the tree are kind of underwhelming. Several even come with drawbacks, so like they can say all they want that these are exciting new changes and they're all good and stuff. We'll see. We've heard that before. Let's wait until the JSON file is available for Path of Building, or maybe we won't know until the league itself launches, but let's take it from there and assess which of these are good. There's oodles of skill changes here. There's no way I'm going to have time for all of them, so I'm just going to note a couple of the big ticket topics. So allegedly there are overall buffs to late game scaling of all skills of all kinds, just damage buffs across the board. Mana costs down, that's a plus. This is a common concern for a lot of players. Good news there. Let's see, exposure. Yeah, so, okay. A lot of these changes, if you look through them, have to do with changes to exposure and lowering enemy resistances. And what they've done is they've streamlined it from being able to fiddle with an enemy's fire, lightning, or cold resistance. Now you do it all at the same time. Exposure is just exposure. There are no more individual elemental curses. It's just elemental weakness. I'm going to be honest. I strongly dislike this change. I'm probably going to talk about it on the podcast tomorrow with Jorgen, Coffee and Chaos. We'll probably get into this in more depth, but I really don't like this change at all. Complexity for complexity's sake, obviously not a good thing. You want to avoid that, but going the other direction isn't really the solution either. I worry that even if we can't immediately see how this takes away some build diversity or decision making, it may, even if we can't see it. And enough of these changes, if you do too many of them, streamlining, dumbing things down, the end point of that is you just wind up with a Diablo-like system where your entire goal is to make your one offensive number go up and your one defensive number go up. Nobody wants that, and this is just a step towards that it starts happening sooner than you think. It may not be immediately apparent how this specific change reduces build diversity, but I really want them to do this kind of thing very sparingly, because lots of PoE's kind of joyfully complex build system arises organically just from having dozens or hundreds of different little levers that you can pull, and you fiddle around in Path of Building and you see which levers, oh, if I pull X, Y, and Z together, that has an interesting effect. You don't always know in advance what the interesting combinations are going to be, and this also limits future design space as well. You don't know what future additions would have made a cool build if they had retained the separate elemental resistance lowering systems. I mean, just like consider Doriani's prototype. That's an example of one that I think this is an indirect nerf to. I could be wrong, but yeah. Don't want to get too deep into the weeds on that one, but we can move on. If we go here, yeah, another one. I hate to stay on the bad news. There are some changes relating to the infusion ground effect. I already talked a little bit about that. This business of you have to run over it and you get these buffs, and then you can use up those buffs. Yeah, I'm just not really a fan of some of that. Throughout this, there are, of course, some skill nerfs. They are the ones that you'd expect if you've been paying attention. The Rake Stomping Ground interaction is gone. That's probably deserved. Lightning Spear no longer gets more damage from consuming frenzy charges. Siege Cascade no longer has a damage bonus against immobilized enemies. Tempest Bell lasts for fewer hits with quality. Wind Serpent's Fury, it no longer has the crazy shockwave behavior that people are abusing. And I think that they hit the Whirling / Incinerate interaction too, but I'm not really an expert in that build. Maybe somebody who's played that can comment. We should talk to somebody who's more familiar with that. There were some changes to Incinerate that I think were intended to target this, but I don't fully understand the interaction, so I'll leave that for somebody else. Speaking of things getting nerfed, if we scroll down to the items section, which will take a while to do because there's a lot of skill changes, some of the broken uniques that you would have expected to get nerfed, they did too. So Beer's Anguish, the Charm, no longer has the crazy Ignite Loop interaction. Tangle Tongue's Critical Strike is down by more than half from where it was. The Deepest Tower and Infernal class, they've been deleted altogether for the moment. They'll reintroduce them when they can find something a little bit more balanced to do with them. And then something that the patch notes didn't specifically kind of call out by name, similar to the deflect thing, but I just have to mention somewhere, is that they're putting many sources of percent. I guess there was one spot way further up where they made a brief one line about this, but basically they're putting more of an emphasis on armor being able to impact elemental damage. They are increasing the sources of that on unique items. They're including it as a modifier on strength-based armor items. Including it, I think they said, on the skill tree as well, with the idea that you scale armor and get both physical mitigation from it, and if you invest into this stat, percent armor applies to elemental damage, you can get elemental mitigation from it as well. Now the trouble is, the numbers on armor, just like the raw numbers of how much damage it mitigates, still seem pretty bad, so I'm worried about this change not being enough, and that you'll still kind of see some left side classes gravitate towards right side builds, go evasion, energy shield, deflect, because it's going to be a really strong combination. We'll have to see. But yeah, I think that wraps it up. Even with my attempts to kind of streamline this, we're at a half an hour there, so I definitely appreciate if you stuck with me. On the whole, I think the changes are positive. There's only a few of them that I think are worrisome, or that I worry will miss the mark. I'm not sure yet what I'm going to be playing based on this. I've still got to give it some study and some thought, but I'll figure it out. Let me know what you think of the patch notes down in the comments. Let me know if there's anything that you wish I had given more attention to, or given attention to at all. And with that, thank you for tuning in, and take it easy.